On a Tuesday morning last October, a gray pickup truck rolled into my bay with a shake in the idle so subtle most drivers would have dismissed it as nothing. The owner was a contractor. He had been driving it that way for 3 months, chalking it up to old age, bad gas, maybe just one of those things. He had already replaced the spark plugs himself. He had paid a shop $60 to run a diagnostic scan that came back with a code he did not understand. He handed me a slip of paper with 4 letters on it, PZA 1906. And then he said something I have heard at least 100 times in the last decade. They told me I probably need a new throttle body, maybe the fuel injectors too. He was bracing for a $1,000 conversation. I looked at that code, looked at that idle, and I already knew, because I had seen this exact story dozens of times. And the part responsible was smaller than his thumb, simpler than anything on that truck, and could be replaced for under $30 if you knew what you were doing. Today, I am going to tell you everything about the one sensor on your car that most mechanics count on you never hearing about. A sensor that costs almost nothing. A sensor that is almost never mentioned at routine service. And a sensor that, when it starts to drift and fail, silently destroys your fuel economy, beats up your engine from the inside, and can eventually take out components that cost thousands to replace. Once you understand what this sensor actually does, you will never look at a rough idle or a sluggish throttle the same way again. Here is the thing about modern engines that nobody explains clearly. Your engine does not breathe on instinct. It does not decide how much fuel to use by feel. Every single combustion event, every explosion inside every cylinder, every fraction of a second your engine is running is calculated. A computer makes those calculations, and that computer depends entirely on sensor data to make them correctly. Take away one critical sensor, or let that sensor start lying just slightly, and the calculations go wrong. The engine keeps running. It keeps sounding normal. It keeps moving the car forward. But under the hood, it is making expensive mistakes thousands of times per minute. That is the trap. The engine does not stop. It compensates. And compensation over time causes destruction. The sensor I am talking about today is the MAP sensor, which means Manifold Absolute Pressure Sensor. It is small, usually about the size of a key fob, sometimes smaller. It sits on or near the intake manifold, connected by either a direct mount or a short vacuum hose. 3 wires run into it. That is it. No moving parts in the traditional sense. No wearing surfaces, no fluid to change. Most drivers have never heard of it. Most technicians mention it only when a diagnostic code forces them to. And that is exactly the problem. To understand why this sensor matters so much, you need to understand what it actually measures and why that measurement is the foundation of everything your engine does. Every time your engine runs, air is being pulled into the intake manifold. That air creates pressure inside the manifold, and that pressure changes constantly depending on how hard the engine is working. At idle, manifold pressure is low because the engine is barely working. When you accelerate hard, the throttle opens wide, more air rushes in, and pressure climbs toward atmospheric. The MAP sensor reads those pressure changes in real time and sends that signal to the engine control unit. The engine control unit uses that number to answer one question: how much load is the engine under right now? From that answer, it calculates ignition timing and fuel delivery. Every single injection event your engine performs is based on what the MAP sensor just told it. Think about what that means. If the MAP sensor drifts even slightly, if it starts reading pressure just a little too high or a little too low, the ECU makes the wrong calculation. It injects too much fuel, or not enough. It fires the spark plugs at the wrong moment. And it does this continuously, thousands of times per minute, until either something breaks dramatically or you figure out what is happening. This is where drivers start losing money without knowing it. A rich fuel mixture, where the engine is injecting too much fuel because the MAP sensor is reading falsely high pressure, causes unburned fuel to pass through the exhaust system. That unburned fuel attacks the catalytic converter. Catalytic converters are not cheap. Depending on the vehicle, they can cost anywhere from $600 to over $2,000 to replace. And here is the brutal part. The original MAP sensor that caused the damage might cost $8 at the parts store. The downstream destruction costs hundreds of times more than the part that started it. And it does not stop at the catalytic converter. A constantly rich mixture fouls spark plugs prematurely. Carbon builds up on intake valves, pistons, and inside cylinders. Oil contamination increases because unburned fuel washes past the piston rings into the crankcase, thinning the oil that protects your engine bearings. Those bearings do not give a warning light when they start to wear. They just wear. Quietly. For a long time before you notice. A lean mixture is arguably worse in the short term. When the MAP sensor reads falsely low pressure, the ECU thinks the engine is barely working and reduces fuel injection. The mixture becomes starved. Combustion temperatures spike dramatically. In a lean condition, the engine runs hotter than it was designed to. Exhaust valves are the first casualty. They are designed to cool themselves by transferring heat into the cylinder head during contact. A lean, running engine runs too hot, too often, and exhaust valves can burn. A burned exhaust valve does not just cause a misfire, it causes a compression loss that cannot be fixed without opening the engine. You are talking about a repair that starts at $1,500 and goes up from there, depending on the vehicle. All of this from a sensor that costs less than a fast food lunch. Now let me tell you how this sensor actually fails, because understanding the failure mode is what separates someone who catches this early from someone who pays the full price. The manifold absolute pressure sensor, commonly called the MAP sensor, rarely fails all at once. It drifts instead. The internal pressure sensing element ages. It gets coated with oil mist from the crankcase ventilation system that routes through the intake manifold. Carbon deposits from combustion can accumulate in the vacuum port the sensor reads through. Heat cycles, hundreds then thousands of them, slowly degrade the tiny electrical components inside. The sensor does not stop working. It becomes less accurate. Its readings shift away from reality by a small amount, then by a slightly larger amount, and eventually enough to start causing real damage. What makes this especially dangerous is that the engine control unit trusts it. Modern engine management systems are very good at compensation. They are designed to detect when something is slightly wrong and adjust other parameters to maintain smooth operation. So when the MAP sensor starts to lie, the engine control unit compensates, fuel trims shift to cover the error, timing is pulled back slightly, the engine continues to run. The driver feels nothing unusual, or perhaps just a vague sense that the vehicle does not feel quite as sharp as it used to. Fuel economy quietly drops. 5% at first, then 10%, then 20% or more, depending on how far the sensor has drifted, all without a single check engine light appearing on the dash. That last point is critical. A MAP sensor can be significantly degraded and still not trigger a diagnostic code. The code only fires when the sensor output falls outside a specific programmed threshold. Below that threshold, there is a wide range of inaccuracy the system will tolerate silently while it costs you money every single time you turn the key. Let me walk you through exactly what a degrading MAP sensor looks like in practice. You might notice the idle is slightly rough or unstable, like the engine is searching. You might notice the car feels hesitant when you accelerate from a stop, a slight stumble before it pulls cleanly. Fuel economy drops gradually and you blame it on winter blend fuel, the cold weather, or just the car getting older. Sometimes there is a faint smell of fuel in the exhaust that you catch occasionally and then forget about. These symptoms stack up slowly, and they are easy to dismiss individually. Together, they are a confession. If the sensor degrades further, the symptoms sharpen. Cold starts become harder. The engine cranks longer before catching because the ECU cannot calculate the correct startup fuel delivery. You might get intermittent stalling, especially when decelerating or pulling up to a stop. You might hear a faint pinging from the engine under load, which is the sound of detonation caused by incorrect ignition timing. Detonation is not a cosmetic issue. It is concussive force inside the combustion chamber, and it damages pistons, rod bearings, and cylinder walls every time it occurs. And if you ignore all of that, if the sensor continues to deteriorate and the engine continues to compensate, eventually the check engine light appears. The code will likely be P0106, P0107, or P0108, which refer to MAP sensor circuit performance and voltage faults. At that point, a shop can tell you exactly what is wrong. But by that point, how much secondary damage has already been done quietly in the months before the light came on? This is the mechanic's question, and it is the one most drivers never think to ask. Here is the part that should make you angry. Diagnosing a MAP sensor problem is not complicated. Any technician with a scan tool and basic training can connect to the OBD port, pull up live sensor data, and watch the MAP sensor reading in real time. At idle, on a healthy engine, the sensor should read low manifold pressure, typically in the range of 20 to 40 kilopascals. When you blip the throttle, the reading should climb smoothly and quickly toward atmospheric pressure. The transition should be immediate, responsive, and consistent. A 6 sensor hesitates. It reads slightly high at idle when it should read low. It lags when throttle opens. It sometimes sticks at a fixed value regardless of what the engine is doing. A technician who knows what to look for identifies that pattern in minutes. But a technician who is looking for a reason to sell parts, or who simply is not trained to look at live sensor data critically, reads the code, sees the words MAP sensor, and orders a replacement without asking the next question. Has this sensor been contaminated, or is it truly failed? Because this matters for your wallet. Before you replace the sensor, check for contamination. The vacuum port the sensor reads through can become partially blocked by carbon or oil deposits from the intake system. The sensor itself can have a film of oil on its measurement element. In some cases, cleaning the port with a cotton swab and a small amount of electronic contact cleaner, and carefully cleaning the sensor housing without touching the internal sensing element restores accurate readings completely. This is not always a fix. Sensors that have developed internal electrical faults need to be replaced. But cleaning costs nothing except 15 minutes of your time, and it filters out false diagnosis before you spend money on a part you might not need. If the sensor does need to come out, the job itself is one of the simplest replacements on any modern vehicle. The sensor is typically held by 1 or 2 small bolts or a friction fit clip. There is one electrical connector. On most cars, the whole procedure takes under 15 minutes with basic hand tools. The part itself, a quality original equipment manufacturer or equivalent sensor from a brand like Bosch, Delphi, or the vehicle maker S original supplier, runs between $30 and $130 depending on the vehicle. Labor at an independent shop is usually $60 to $120 at most. Total cost, done properly, is almost always under $250. That is the repair. Compare that to what you risk by ignoring it. A catalytic converter costing $800 to $2,000, spark plugs fouled prematurely, valve damage, and bearing wear from oil contaminated by raw fuel. The math is not subtle. One more thing before we talk about prevention, and this matters if you have already been quoted for bigger repairs after a MAP sensor code appeared. Do not let a shop sell you a throttle body because of a MAP sensor code. Do not let them sell you fuel injectors. Do not let them sell you an intake manifold or a new ECU. The MAP sensor code tells you about the MAP sensor. Everything else should be confirmed independently before a single additional dollar leaves your wallet. I have personally seen estimates over $3,000 written up for vehicles that needed a $40 sensor and a vacuum hose inspection. The code is not permission to explore. It is a specific direction. Follow it. Now here is how to protect yourself going forward. The MAP sensor, or manifold absolute pressure sensor, can be affected by the overall health of your intake system. A clogged air filter increases restriction and changes manifold pressure behavior in ways that push the sensor outside its optimal measurement range. A cracked or loose vacuum hose connected to the sensor changes what it is actually reading, and it can completely mimic sensor failure. Dirty throttle bodies create unusual pressure patterns in the manifold. Crankcase ventilation systems that are not maintained allow oil mist to accumulate in the intake and coat the sensor port over time. These problems can accelerate sensor degradation or create sensor-like symptoms in a perfectly healthy sensor. Maintain a clean air filter. Inspect vacuum hoses at every oil change, especially the short hose that connects directly to the MAP sensor if your vehicle uses one. If your engine has a crankcase ventilation system with a filter or a separator, service it on schedule. These habits do more than protect the MAP sensor. They protect the entire intake and combustion system, and they cost almost nothing compared to the repairs they prevent. There is a version of every story I told you today that ends differently. The contractor with the shaking pickup could have driven it for another 6 months. The MAP sensor would have drifted further. The fuel trims would have climbed. The catalytic converter would have started cooking. The spark plugs would have needed premature replacement. The bill would have been $1,000, maybe $2,000, with no one ever connecting it back to the original sensor that started the chain. Instead, I showed him the live data on the scanner. I showed him what the sensor should read and what it was reading. I showed him the $42 sensor I was going to put in. He watched me do it in 12 minutes. He drove away with a smooth, idle, correct fuel trims and money still in his pocket. That is the outcome that comes from knowing what to look for before the damage is done. A sensor the size of your key fob, a measurement made thousands of times per minute, a failure that hides in plain sight. Now you know it exists. Now you know what it does, how it fails, and what it costs when you catch it early versus what it costs when you do not. Before you close this video, go out to your car, start it, and notice the idle. Notice if there is any hesitation when you first pull onto the road. Notice if your fuel economy has been slowly slipping over the last year and you never found a clear reason why. Now you know one place to look. If this video gave you the information you needed, hit the like button so more drivers find it before the damage is done. Subscribe if you want the kind of knowledge that saves you money before a shop has the chance to take it. Drop a comment telling me the last time a small part caused you a big problem, because those stories matter, and the mechanic who shares them is on your side. The most expensive repairs are almost never caused by the most dramatic failures. They are caused by small sensors ignored long enough, trusted by computers that never question them. Now you know the one hiding in your intake manifold. Knowing it is the difference between a $40 fix and a $4,000 lesson.